Hey everybody, and welcome back to another Max Velocity weather forecast. And in today's forecast, we'll be breaking down a fairly large severe weather event that'll be taking place across parts of the United States over the next few days, bringing the risk for extreme hail, damaging winds, and perhaps a few tornadoes. We'll also be talking about the extreme flooding potential in one part of the United States and the massive heat wave that'll be impacting over 25 states. I'll give you the latest breakdown on everything that you need to know in this forecast. But let's first begin with what's happening across the United States today. We'll first begin with areas over on the East Coast. That is where a ton of shower and storm activity continues to unravel over the past 24 hours. We've been seeing some extreme flooding in areas like Vermont and New Hampshire. Some areas have had collapsed bridges, overflowing rivers. It's unbelievable what we're seeing there, especially for this time of the year. And all of it's to blame from a low pressure system that's located near the surface just west of New England. And then we have a massive trough back up in Canada. So it's a really tight system here that we're watching. It's slow moving. It's been bringing tons of rain. The rain's going south to north, so we're seeing just consistent rainfall with a very slow moving low pressure system. It's really just a recipe for disaster right now in the Northeast. So we've been seeing tons of rainfall there, lots of flooding. Obviously, make sure if you have any friends or family there, make sure they're doing all right, because there's a lot of rainfall falling there. Luckily though, this will start to move out over the next couple of days. I'll give you a breakdown on that in a moment. For those back over in the Central Plains, anywhere in the Great Plains, really back into the Midwest and Ohio Valley, it's fairly dry right now. There's really not a whole lot of cloud cover, but that's only for a little bit longer. We're going to see some pretty significant severe storms start to ramp up over the next 48 hours. That's going to cause some concern here across areas like the Midwest and the Central Plains for some very large hail, damaging winds, and again, maybe even a few tornadoes. We'll talk about more on that as well in just a moment. But let's talk a bit more about the jet stream, because the jet stream has a lot to do with our weather pattern. It's really what controls the weather here in the United States. With El Nino, we do see typically a lot warmer of a summer. We've already seen that. And the big reason why that we have such a warm summer right now is because one of the reasons why is because we have a massive heat dome in the southwest United States. This is bringing tons of heat, and not just that, a very strong southerly pole is bringing lots of moisture out of the Gulf of Mexico. That's leading to feel like temperatures being a lot warmer than the actual temperature itself, because it's just so humid. Some areas have dew points in the 70s, and even some areas closer to the upper 70s, which is extremely oppressive, which makes it again very uncomfortable outside. Back over on the East Coast in the Northeast, that's where we have a low pressure system located. That's what's bringing a lot of the rainfall and that recipe for disaster in the Northeast with the extreme flooding that we've been seeing over the past 24 hours, with a very rare high risk of flash flooding being issued as well for areas like Vermont today. And then another key piece to the weather pattern is the very large trough that's located up in Canada. It's not really impacting the United States weather a whole lot right now, but it is kind of sitting that little low pressure system in New England. That's what's really causing it, is that low pressure system that's just so large. And once we go out throughout the next few days, you'll notice that low pressure system in Canada is just spinning around up there. It's not really moving a whole lot. And then back over in the southern plains in the southwest United States, that heat dome just sits there. In addition to this, we have strong upper level winds continuing across areas like the Midwest and the Central Plains. This will actually increase the risk for severe weather, increasing the longevity of some of the supercells that we see out of some of these severe weather setups. And that's also going to allow for basically a train of storms to be going across the Central and Northern Plains, through the Midwest and the Ohio Valley, and then eventually into the Northeast, where we're going to continue to see more and more rainfall. So this is just going to all keep feeding into the rainfall that we've already seen. Now, once we get closer to the weekend, heat is really going to kick up, especially back over in the southwest United States. Death Valley could get close to 130 degrees. The last time we were over 130 degrees in Death Valley was back in about, I believe, 2013. And then prior to that, the highest temperature on Earth's history is 134 degrees in 1913 in Death Valley. That's probably not going to be challenged, but it's going to be very hot there over the next few days because of this massive heat dome. Southerly winds will continue bringing moisture that could actually increase the risk for some storm activity as well in the southern plains, but severe weather is not expected there. And then the low pressure system will continue to sit back up in Canada. And then going into next week, a stronger low pressure system is expected to develop. That could increase the risk for some severe weather as well in parts of Canada near maybe Quebec, and as well as back through areas in the Northeast. I mentioned that train of storms, and if you look at the European Model's estimated rainfall totals over the next 6 to 7 days, the most rainfall that's going to fall is primarily across areas in the Ohio Valley, the Midwest, and parts of the Great Plains. And the reason why, again, again is because of those strong upper level winds basically feeding more storms into areas in these regions that really don't need much rainfall. The only area that needs rainfall desperately right now would be the Midwest, where we've been seeing increasing drought conditions in those areas. So definitely concerning there, but the Northeast really does not need more rainfall, and more rain is expected there over the next 7 days. Now let's talk more about the severe weather potential for the next several days. We'll begin with today. There is currently an enhanced risk of severe weather. That's going to include areas in Kansas and Nebraska. Very large slight risk as well. It goes from the Michigan Peninsula all the way back through Texas. It's a very large area today. Main concern, though, will be large to very large hail. Damaging winds, though, is also a pretty big concern. That's why we do have an enhanced risk of severe weather. You'll notice that hatched area that does represent a chance of seeing damaging winds exceeding 75 miles per hour. And with that being said, we do have a moderate risk for flying trampolines today. That is primarily going to be focused, though, across areas in the Central Plains. And then back through the Midwest, we do have a chance for at least some scattered damaging winds up to about 60 to 70 miles per hour. Large hail concern today, primarily focused there across areas in northwest Iowa, back through northern parts of Kansas. That is where we could see some hail upwards of 3 to 3.5 inches in diameter. That is about the size of an apple. So you definitely want to make sure you are protecting your vehicle today. This is the area, though, that we have that chance for hail exceeding 2 inches in diameter. Outside of there, in the Midwest and as well as back through the high plains, those areas will primarily be watching for a hail threat up to about golf ball sized out of maybe a few supercells that do end up developing later today. Tornado risk, it's very low today. It's primarily going to be across areas in the Midwest, back in Wisconsin, as well as near Minneapolis. Very low chance for a couple tornadoes. Those would be probably on the brief and weak side of things, so not too concerning, but make sure you have a tornado action plan in place just in case there are any tornadoes up that direction. Now let's talk more about the timing. We'll begin with areas in the Midwest, and this afternoon storms are going to fire up pretty quickly. Around 4 or 5 o'clock is when storms are expected to fire up, and those ones will initially produce mainly damaging winds and large hail. Tornado risk will really increase, though, probably around 6 to 7 o'clock. But again, the tornado risk is very low today, but it's going to increase during that time frame. So we'll have a better chance of a tornado between about 6 to 8 o'clock or so, maybe up until about 10 o'clock this evening, and eventually going closer around 9, 10 o'clock. Storms continue to move off to the east. A lot of these will be mainly damaging winds after 10 o'clock with maybe some sporadic hail. Wouldn't rule out an isolated tornado, but I think the risk overall tonight is very low. And eventually going closer to midnight, those storms move down to the south and east, and during the overnight hours, all the storm activity will weaken off across the Midwest. Back over in the Central Plains, storms will fire up this afternoon as well, right around about the same time as the Midwest, 4 or 5 o'clock or so. That's where we'll be watching storms firing up in 2 different areas, one of which will be back up in Nebraska, and then another one will be back over in eastern Colorado. And those 2 different areas are going to be a bit different. The storms that fire up over in Colorado have a bit better of a chance of large hail, and then over in Nebraska, a slightly higher chance of damaging winds. So a couple of little differences there. Once we get closer to around 7 to 8 o'clock, storms will start to kind of collide with each other. We might see an MCS form tonight, which is a mesoscale convective system. That basically is a fancy term for a cluster of storms that could produce some scattered to numerous damaging winds. And eventually during the overnight hours, that line of storm starts to weaken out. But notice back over in Oklahoma, there could be some pretty significant storm activity down that direction overnight tonight. And you'll notice here in the Texas Panhandle, storms are going to fire up around about 5, 6, 7 o'clock tonight. They'll move off to the east. And if an outflow boundary is strong enough, we could see a lot of storm activity really start to pop off after midnight across areas in Oklahoma and Texas. This will be mainly damaging winds with maybe a little bit of large hail. And eventually going closer to around 2 to 3 in the morning, storms continue to move off to the east. Make sure you're being mindful, though, if you're in the southern plains, there is still a moderate risk of flying trampolines down here as well, which is, again, on the lower scale of things, it's a medium risk, but definitely make sure you're prepared for that threat as well, because we'll probably see at least a few flying trampolines with the damaging wind potential for tonight. And tomorrow's severe weather threat begins to shift more off to the east. You'll notice there's a pretty large area for a threat of severe weather from Montana back into Michigan. For mainly the Central Plains in the Midwest, though, main concern going into tomorrow will be the threat of damaging winds and large hail. You'll notice that large hail threat, there's going to be another chance for hail exceeding 2 inches in diameter, perhaps up to apple-sized hail is possible back in areas like Nebraska and South Dakota. That is where we're going to be having to monitor, though, that threat for very large hail. Damaging winds as well, pretty much the same area. We'll be watching for damaging winds between 60 to 70 miles per hour. Another chance for an MCS situation exists tomorrow, which means, again, a mesoscale convective system. Fancy word for a cluster or line of storms producing some significant severe weather. But you'll notice that tornado threat as we go into tomorrow, not too concerning, but it's on the low scale of things. So just make sure you have that tornado action plan in place just in case. That's across areas in Nebraska, Iowa, and as well as northwest Missouri. Here's the timing for tomorrow. Storms will fire up actually pretty late tomorrow. Probably going to fire up after sunset back in areas in southeast South Dakota. These storms will collapse down to the south and east, and they'll be moving towards areas areas like Iowa and maybe even parts of Nebraska. Eventually going closer to midnight, that area of storms becomes a bit more organized. That's when we could see an MCS form. And if an MCS forms, again, we could be watching for some scattered to numerous damaging winds across a line of storms. And eventually going into the overnight hours, storms continue to march down to the south and east, and then maybe another area of storms developing overnight in southwest Iowa. And again, damaging winds being the main concern tomorrow, but initial sails could produce some large to very large hail. Back over in the Midwest, pretty much the same situation here. We'll be watching for storm activity during the late evening into the overnight hours, and eventually going into the overnight, storms continue to push down to the south and east, which again, damaging winds being the main concern here. And then lastly, we have a fairly large area to watch for heading into Wednesday for severe weather. This is another situation where we could see an MCS form, meaning the threat for damaging winds being the main concern. I'll talk about more on this in our next forecast. Make sure you're subscribed down below and like the video. This forecast is not brought to you by anybody once again.